My wifesalpha lover tried TOSTDL. My wife and embarrassed me. I got revenge. When the man I trusted most tried to steal the woman I love, I had two choices: walk away or fight back. What I uncovered changed everything. Stay tuned, because by the end of this story, you'll see just how far I went to expose the truth, and why I'll never be the same. This isn't just another tale of betrayal. It's my fight for redemption and revenge. Don't miss it. I remember the day I first saw her, clear as if it had just happened. It was a Friday evening at one of those art gallery openings downtown. The kind of event I'd normally avoid. My coworker Greg had dragged me along, saying it'd be good for business to mingle with the city's creative elite. But I wasn't in the mood for small talk. That changed the second Chloe walked into the room. It was like the air shifted. People noticed her immediately, but not because she was loud or flashy. No. It was something else entirely. She carried herself with an effortless confidence, the kind that made you want to lean in, to hear what she had to say. Her dark hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, and when she smiled, the dimples in her cheeks gave her an approachable warmth. But it wasn't just her looks, it was the way she moved. The way she seemed completely comfortable in her own skin. A rare thing in a room full of people, trying so hard to be noticed. I tried not to stare, but my eyes kept drifting back to her. I was nursing a bourbon on the rocks, half listening to Greg talk about a potential new client, when I caught Chloe glancing in my direction. For a split second, I thought I imagined it. But then, she smiled, just a faint, curious smile, and I felt this jolt in my chest. Like my heart had skipped a beat. It was absurd. I was a grown man, not some lovesick teenager. Still, something about her pulled me in, and I couldn't ignore it. When she started making her way toward the bar, I found myself standing straighter, brushing imaginary lint off my jacket, suddenly self-conscious about how I looked. "Hi," she said, her voice warm and inviting. "I don't think we've met before. I'm Chloe." She extended her hand, and I took it without hesitation. Her grip was firm, confident. "Evan," I replied, trying to sound calm, though my pulse was racing. "Nice to meet you." She tilted her head, studying me for a moment, then said, "So, what's your story? Are you one of the artists here, or?" I laughed lightly, shaking my head. "No, definitely not. I'm in real estate, commercial mostly." I gestured vaguely at the room. "This isn't really my scene, but my friend Greg thought I should come." Chloe raised an eyebrow. "Not your scene? So, what is your scene, Evan?" Her question caught me off guard, but I could tell she was genuinely curious. "I guess I'm more of a quiet dinner, good conversation kind of guy," I said. "Not that I don't appreciate the arts, but I'm usually more at home in my office than at an event like this." Chloe smiled again. A smile that made it hard to think straight. "Well, maybe you just haven't been to the right kind of events." She leaned slightly closer, her tone playful. "Or maybe you just needed the right company." I felt my cheeks warm, but I managed to keep my voice steady. "Maybe you're right." We spent the rest of the evening talking. Chloe had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room, even in a crowd. She told me about her work as a curator at a local gallery, how she loved bringing underappreciated artists into the spotlight. Her passion was infectious, and before I knew it, I was opening up to her in a way I rarely did with anyone. I told her about my career, how I'd spent years climbing the ladder, building my own brokerage, sacrificing weekends and vacations to close deals. I told her how, lately, I'd been feeling like something was missing, like all the success in the world couldn't fill the void I couldn't quite define. Chloe listened intently, her eyes never leaving mine, and when I finished, she placed a hand lightly on my arm and said, "Maybe it's not about what you're doing, but who you're doing it with." Those words stuck with me long after we parted ways that night. Chloe gave me her number before she left, and I found myself hesitating, unsure if I should call her the next day or play it cool and wait. But in the end, I couldn't resist. I texted her the next morning something light and casual about how much I'd enjoyed our conversation, and she replied within minutes. We made plans to meet for coffee, and from that moment on, it was like a whirlwind. Chloe became the person I couldn't stop thinking about, the one I wanted to share everything with. She brought a sense of spontaneity and joy into my life that I hadn't felt in years. With her, it wasn't just about the dates or the places we went. It was about how she made me feel alive, seen, and understood. I thought I'd found something real, something solid. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. But as I'd come to learn, appearances can be deceiving. Chloe wasn't just a new chapter in my life, she was a storm waiting to happen. And I never saw it coming. I thought everything was fine at first. Chloe and I spent nearly every free moment together in those early days. We'd find new restaurants downtown, take late-night drives along the coast, and just talk about everything: our goals, our fears, the things that made us tick. It felt effortless, natural. I hadn't felt that way in years. She brought color into my otherwise monochrome life, and for a while, I thought she felt the same way. But little by little, things started to shift. It wasn't obvious at first. At least, not to me. I don't know if I was blind, naive, or just too desperate to believe that what we had was real. I wanted it to be real. I needed it to be real. At first, it was small things. Chloe would get home later than usual from her gallery events. She'd tell me it was just a few extra hours with her colleagues, or an impromptu meeting about some upcoming show. I didn't think much of it. Her work was important to her, and I wanted to be supportive. But then it started happening more frequently. Late nights turned into early mornings, and her explanations grew vaguer. "Oh, I got caught up talking with Alex," she'd say, throwing the name out there like I should already know who he was. I did know who he was, in a vague, peripheral way. He was one of the gallery's artists, talented, charming, always quick with a witty remark. I remember meeting him briefly at one of Chloe's events, shaking his hand, and thinking he seemed harmless. I never thought twice about him after that. But now, suddenly, his name was coming up more and more. Chloe would mention how Alex had these incredible ideas, how he saw art in a way that inspired her, how he made her laugh during long, stressful meetings. At first, I told myself it was nothing. It was just work, just a colleague. But then I started noticing other things. Her phone, for instance, was always within reach but always face down. When we'd go out to dinner, she'd glance at it when she thought I wasn't looking. And sometimes I'd see a faint smile creep across her face. I tried to tell myself it was just work stuff, or maybe a text from a friend. It wasn't like Chloe to be sneaky. She was straightforward, or at least I thought she was. I didn't want to be the kind of guy who checked his partner's phone, or jumped to conclusions. I hated the idea of being jealous. So I let it slide. Again and again, I let it slide. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Chloe's behavior wasn't just about her phone or her late nights. It was her demeanor. She seemed distracted when we were together, her mind always somewhere else. When I'd tell her about my day, she'd nod absent-mindedly, but her responses were short, almost mechanical. And then there were the compliments. Chloe had always been generous with her praise in the beginning. She'd tell me I looked handsome in a certain shirt, that she admired how hard I worked, that she appreciated how I always made her feel cared for. But that started to fade. I'd put on a nice suit for a business dinner, and she wouldn't say a word. I'd surprise her with takeout from her favorite Thai place, and she'd barely acknowledge it. The warmth that once defined our relationship was cooling, and I couldn't figure out why. One evening, I decided to confront her. She had come home late again, and this time, she smelled different. Not her usual perfume, but something musky, distinctly masculine. I couldn't ignore it. "Where were you tonight?" I asked, my tone more serious than I intended. Chloe glanced at me, almost annoyed. "I told you, I was at the gallery," she replied, slipping off her heels and heading for the kitchen. "We had a meeting about the new exhibition." I followed her, my chest tight. "You're sure that's all it was?" She stopped, turning to look at me with raised eyebrows. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice sharp. "You think I'm lying?" I hesitated, unsure if I should press the issue or let it go. But I couldn't help myself. "I don't know, Chloe. Lately, it feels like you're not being completely honest with me." Her expression hardened. "Evan, you're overthinking this. I've been busy, that's all. Alex and I had to go over some last-minute details for the show. That's it." Her words sounded convincing, but there was something in her eyes, something distant, something guarded that made my stomach churn. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But the doubts had already taken root. Over the next few weeks, The pattern continued. Late nights, vague excuses, and more mentions of Alex than I cared to hear. I started to feel like a stranger in my own relationship. I'd watch her get ready for these events, perfecting her makeup, choosing just the right dress, and I'd wonder who she was doing it for. Was it really about the gallery, or was it for him? I hated that I was thinking this way, but I couldn't stop. I felt paranoid, and the worst part was, I didn't even know if I was right to feel that way. One night, I decided to show up at one of her gallery functions unannounced. I told myself it was just to surprise her, to see her in her element. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I needed to see how she acted when she didn't know I was watching. I arrived early and stood near the back, blending in with the small crowd. I spotted her almost immediately, laughing, chatting, the center of attention as always. She looked stunning, as she always did at these events. But my eyes weren't just on her. They were searching for him. And then I saw them together, Chloe and Alex. She was standing close to him, her body language relaxed and open. She laughed at something he said, reaching out to touch his arm briefly. It wasn't blatant. To anyone else, it might have seemed harmless. But to me, it was a gut punch. I didn't confront her that night. I didn't say anything. I just watched, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and confusion. When she got home later, I didn't mention that I had been there. I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over in my head. I kept telling myself that maybe I was overreacting, that I was seeing things that weren't really there. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing faster than I could control. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I knew something wasn't right. I just didn't know what to do about it. What would you do if you saw the one you love standing too close to someone else? Their laughter and glances saying more than any words ever could. Would you confront them right then and there, or wait to gather proof? Let me know in the comments. 1. If you'd walk away immediately. 2. If you'd stay silent and investigate further. I couldn't stop thinking about that night at the gallery. The way Chloe and Alex had been standing so close, laughing like they shared some private joke, haunted me. It felt like a shadow had settled over our relationship, a dark cloud I couldn't shake. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. I kept repeating that mantra in my head. You're imagining things, Evan. You're reading too much into this. But no matter how hard I tried, the doubts wouldn't go away. Every time Chloe's phone buzzed, every time she mentioned Alex's name in passing, that knot in my stomach tightened. It was like a slow, creeping sickness that I couldn't cure. And it was only getting worse. I tried to confront her about it again one evening, after dinner. We were sitting in the living room, her scrolling through her phone, me pretending to read a report from work. I glanced at her, wondering if I should bring it up. Just ask her, I told myself. Ask her straight out. What's the worst that can happen? But I knew what would happen. She'd roll her eyes, brush me off, accuse me of being insecure. And yet, I couldn't stay silent any longer. Chloe, I said, keeping my tone as even as I could. She looked up, eyebrows raised. What's going on with Alex? Her expression changed for a split second. It was subtle, just a slight twitch of her mouth, a flicker of something in her eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by a calm, almost bored look. What do you mean? She asked, her voice casual. I already told you, he's just a friend. You mention him all the time, I said, my voice tightening. You spend a lot of time with him, and it feels like I hesitated, searching for the right words. It feels like you're more focused on him than on us. Chloe sighed, leaning back against the couch. Evan, we've been over this. Alex is a colleague, a friend, that's it. You're reading too much into things. Her dismissive tone stung more than I expected. I clenched my jaw, trying to stay calm. Then why do I feel like you're hiding something? Why do I feel like I'm always the last to know what's going on? She set her phone down, crossing her arms. Because you're looking for something that isn't there. I'm sorry if I haven't been as present as I should be, but my work has been really demanding lately. Alex happens to be involved in a lot of those projects, so yes, I talk about him. But that doesn't mean anything is going on. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the doubts were like splinters under my skin, impossible to ignore. I nodded slowly, not wanting to push it any further, at least not that night. But her words didn't erase my suspicions. If anything, they made them worse. The days that followed were filled with more of the same. Chloe's late nights, her frequent mentions of Alex, her phone that never seemed to leave her side. I started paying closer attention, watching for any small sign that might confirm what I already feared. And then, one afternoon, I noticed something. Chloe had left her laptop open on the kitchen table while she was upstairs. I walked past it, my heart pounding. I didn't want to be that guy, the one who snooped, who invaded her privacy. But something in me snapped. I had to know. I had to find out if I was losing my mind or if my instincts were right. I hesitated, standing over the open laptop, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then I sat down and quickly scanned the screen. It was her email, her inbox wide open. My eyes landed on a subject line that made my stomach drop. Looking forward to tonight. It was from Alex. My hands shook as I clicked on it. The message was short, friendly on the surface, but there was a familiarity to his words that made my chest tighten. He talked about a dinner they'd planned, about how he couldn't wait to see her. And Chloe had replied, just as warmly, confirming the time and place. I leaned back in the chair, my mind racing. My worst fears were being confirmed right in front of me. But even as I sat there, staring at the screen, I realized something. This wasn't just about Chloe and Alex. This was about me, about what I was willing to accept, what I was willing to endure. I had let my doubts fester for so long that I no longer trusted my own judgment. But now, I had proof. Proof that something was happening behind my back. Proof that I wasn't crazy. When Chloe came back downstairs, I closed the laptop and tried to act normal. I couldn't confront her yet. Not until I figured out what to do next. But that night, as I lay in bed beside her, the distance between us felt like a canyon. Every time she turned over, every time her phone lit up on the nightstand, I felt that sickening churn in my gut. I was living with a stranger, someone who could smile at me, kiss me, and then exchange emails like that with someone else. I didn't know how much longer I could take it. A few days later, Chloe told me she had another late meeting at the gallery. She kissed me on the cheek and left without a second thought. But this time, I followed her. I knew where she'd be, at the restaurant she and Alex had mentioned in their emails. I parked across the street and waited, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to see what I knew was coming. But I couldn't stay away. I needed to know for sure. When I saw them through the restaurant window, laughing, leaning in close, it felt like the air had been knocked out of me. Chloe looked happier than she had in weeks. Her face lit up with a smile I hadn't seen in a long time. And Alex, he looked at her the way I used to look at her, like she was the most incredible person in the world. I wanted to burst in, to confront them both, to demand an explanation. But I couldn't move. I just sat there, watching, my heart breaking all over again. Eventually, I drove home, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, sadness, betrayal. But most of all, I felt numb. Like the person I thought I knew, the life I thought I had, was gone. I wasn't sure what to do next, but I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. I couldn't sleep that night. The image of Chloe and Alex together laughing, leaning in close, kept replaying in my mind. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Every detail burned into my brain. The way she smiled at him. The way he looked at her. Like they shared some private world that I'd never been a part of. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't take a full breath. I kept telling myself to get some rest, but every time I closed my eyes, the scene would flash again. And I'd feel that same sick churn in my stomach. It wasn't just the betrayal that got to me. It was the realization that I hadn't been imagining it. All those little doubts, all the signs I'd been brushing off, they were real. And now, I couldn't ignore them anymore. When morning came, I felt like a zombie. My head ached, my eyes were gritty, and my thoughts were a mess. Chloe was already up, sipping coffee at the kitchen counter like nothing was wrong. She glanced up at me as I walked in, her expression calm, maybe even cheerful. "Morning," she said, her voice light and easy. I nodded, mumbling something that could have been morning or just a grunt. I couldn't look at her. I was afraid she'd see it on my face, everything I knew, everything I was feeling. So I busied myself with pouring a cup of coffee, pretending like everything was normal. But inside, I was screaming. How could she sit there, acting so casual, after everything she'd done? We went about our day like that, playing the roles of a normal couple. Chloe chatted about her upcoming projects, the gallery's new exhibit, and some fundraiser she was planning to attend. I nodded along, offering the occasional sounds good or, uh-huh, but my mind was 1,000 miles away. I kept replaying the emails, their dinner, the way she smiled at him. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. How long had this been going on? How long had she been lying to me? I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but I didn't. Not yet. I needed time to think, to figure out what I was going to do. But the anger was always there, bubbling just below the surface. That evening, after dinner, I tried again. I waited until she was putting the dishes away before I said anything. Chloe, I began, trying to keep my voice steady. She turned, a plate still in her hands, and looked at me. Yeah? I hesitated, my heart pounding. I need to ask you something, I said, trying to sound calm. Her expression shifted, just slightly enough to make me doubt myself. What's on your mind? She asked. I took a deep breath. What's really going on between you and Alex? She blinked, then sighed heavily, putting the plate down on the counter. Evan, she said, her voice tinged with exasperation. We've been over this. He's just a friend, a colleague. I don't know why you keep bringing this up. I felt the anger rise in my chest again. Because it doesn't feel that way, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. It doesn't feel like he's just a friend. And I can't help but notice you spend more time with him than you do with me. She crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. I'm spending time at work, she said. That's all this is. You need to stop reading into things that aren't there. Her calm, dismissive tone made me want to scream. I clenched my fists at my sides, trying to keep my emotions in check. You don't get it, Chloe, I said, my voice low but tense. I feel like I'm losing you. I feel like you're slipping away, and I don't know what to do about it. If it's not Alex, then tell me what it is. Tell me what's changed. For a moment, she looked at me, really looked at me, and I thought she might actually say something. But then she shook her head, picking up the plate again. Nothing's changed, Evan, she said, her tone tired. You're imagining things. And that was it. She turned away, and the conversation was over. I stood there for a moment, staring at her back, feeling like I'd just run headfirst into a brick wall. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to fix this. All I knew was that the woman I loved was slipping away from me, and I had no idea how to stop it. The doubt, the anger, the frustration, it all sat heavy in my chest as I left the kitchen and went to the living room, collapsing onto the couch. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that I was just being paranoid, that I was reading too much into things. But deep down, I knew. I wasn't imagining it. Something had changed, and it wasn't just in my head. The rest of the night passed in a haze. Chloe sat beside me on the couch, scrolling through her phone, while I stared blankly at the TV. We didn't speak much. The silence between us felt like a chasm, growing wider by the second. I kept glancing at her out of the corner of my eye, wondering what was going through her mind. Did she know how much this was killing me? Did she even care? Or was she so wrapped up in her own world that she didn't notice how far we drifted apart? When we went to bed that night, she fell asleep quickly, as if nothing was wrong. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I thought about the Chloe I first met, the woman who had been so full of life, so vibrant, so completely captivating. And I wondered where that woman had gone. Was she still in there somewhere, hidden beneath the secrets and lies? Or had she disappeared for good? I didn't have any answers. All I had were questions, and a sinking feeling that the person I thought I knew was gone forever. I couldn't shake the feeling that Chloe was hiding something. The way she dismissed my questions, the way she always had an answer that seemed rehearsed, none of it felt right. I'd start asking myself if I was going crazy, if I was reading into things that weren't there. But the little signs just kept piling up. It wasn't just her late nights or the constant mentions of Alex. It was the small, seemingly inconsequential details that gnawed at me. Like the way her laughter seemed brighter when she talked about him, or how her whole demeanor shifted when she mentioned his name. It wasn't something I could put my finger on, but it was there. And it was eating me alive. I started paying more attention, watching her closer than I ever had before. Every time her phone buzzed, every time she excused herself to take a call, every time she came home with that faint scent of cologne. That wasn't mine. I felt the tension in my chest tighten. I didn't want to believe it, but my gut kept telling me otherwise. I tried to distract myself with work, throwing myself into meetings and late nights at the office. But even then, she was in the back of my mind. Her voice, her smile, her laughter, it all felt like a memory slipping through my fingers. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I came home to find Chloe on the phone. She was sitting in the kitchen, her back to me, speaking softly. I couldn't make out her words, but the tone of her voice made my stomach churn. It wasn't the warm, casual tone she used when she talked to her friends or colleagues. It was different, intimate, almost secretive. She didn't notice me standing there in the doorway, frozen, trying to decide if I should let her know I was home, or wait for her to finish. I opted for the latter, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to say something. When she finally hung up, I stepped into the room, pretending I'd just walked in. She turned, startled, and forced a smile. "Hey, you're home late," she said, slipping her phone into her pocket. I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Long day at the office," I replied, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. She started rambling about her day, some new gallery opening, a meeting with Alex, but I barely heard her. I kept thinking about the call, about who she was talking to, and what she might have been saying. My mind was racing, trying to connect the dots, but none of it added up. Or maybe it did, and I just didn't want to admit it. The next morning, she was out the door early, heading to another meeting, she said. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my coffee, feeling a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I knew I couldn't keep going like this, walking on eggshells, doubting every word that came out of her mouth. But what could I do? Confronting her again felt pointless. She'd just deny it, brush me off, make me feel like I was the crazy one. And maybe I was. Maybe I was just imagining it all. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I thought back to the emails I'd seen, the dinner I'd witnessed, the way Alex looked at her like she was the only woman in the room. It wasn't normal. It wasn't right. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. But it was becoming impossible to ignore. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, like my world was crumbling, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I decided I had to find out the truth. I couldn't live in this limbo anymore. If Chloe wasn't going to tell me what was going on, I'd have to figure it out myself. I didn't know how or when, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Something had to give. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just keep sitting in the dark, wondering, doubting, second-guessing myself at every turn. Chloe wasn't going to tell me what was really going on. That much was clear. If I wanted answers, I was going to have to find them on my own. But how? I couldn't just ask her again, not after the last time. She'd just deny it, deflect, make me feel like I was overreacting. And maybe I was, but there was no way to know for sure unless I dug deeper. I hated the thought of it, snooping, prying, going behind her back. It wasn't who I was, and it wasn't who I wanted to be. But at that point, I felt like I didn't have a choice. I needed to know. The next time she left for a meeting, one of those late-night gallery events she was always running off to, I waited until she was gone before I started looking. I felt sick to my stomach as I picked up her phone, which she'd left charging on the kitchen counter. My hands were shaking. I almost put it down and walked away. Almost. But then I remembered the way she had smiled when she mentioned Alex, the way she laughed at his jokes, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about him. I couldn't let it go. I had to know. I unlocked her phone. It wasn't hard. She'd never bothered to set a new password and started scrolling through her messages. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Just the usual chats with friends, coworkers, her sister. But then I came across a thread with Alex. My heart stopped. I hesitated, staring at his name on the screen. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my breath coming faster. This was it. I could still back out. I could put the phone down and pretend I never saw it. But I couldn't, not anymore. I opened the messages. At first, it was just small talk, nothing incriminating. They were talking about the gallery, about the next exhibit, about upcoming events. But then the tone shifted. Alex started calling her Chloe instead of Chloe, and the way he phrased things felt intimate, familiar. I read one message. I had a great time at dinner the other night. Can't wait to see you again soon. My stomach dropped. I scrolled back, my fingers trembling, and found another. You're amazing, Chloe. I don't know how I'd get through these long days without you. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I put the phone down, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. My head was spinning. I didn't know what to think, what to feel. Part of me wanted to throw the phone across the room, to scream, to confront her right then and there. But I couldn't. I needed more. I needed to be sure. So I kept looking. I found more messages, plans to meet up, little jokes that I wasn't a part of, compliments that went beyond professional courtesy. It wasn't blatant. They weren't outright saying anything that couldn't be explained away, but it was enough. Enough to make me feel like I was losing my mind, like I'd been a fool all along. How had I missed this? How had I not seen it sooner? When Chloe came home that night, I tried to act normal. I don't know how I did it. My hands were still trembling, my heart racing, but somehow, I managed to keep my voice steady. How was the meeting? I asked, watching her closely. She smiled, setting her bag down on the couch. It was good, she said, her tone light. We made some great progress on the exhibit. I nodded, forcing a smile. That's good. I'm glad it went well. I felt like I was suffocating. I wanted to yell, to demand answers, to throw the messages in her face and make her explain herself. But I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to be sure. I needed to be calm. So I waited. I waited until she went to bed, until the house was quiet, and then I sat in the dark, replaying everything in my mind. I knew I couldn't keep doing this, living with the constant doubt, the constant suspicion. I needed to confront her, to get the truth out in the open. But I also knew that once I did, everything would change. There'd be no going back. I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. So I stayed silent. I stayed silent and waited, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I was wrong. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. Deep down, I knew the truth. I just didn't want to face it. Not yet. Everything I'd been feeling, the doubts, the suspicions, the anger, finally came to a head one rainy Friday night. Chloe had left the house hours ago for yet another gallery meeting. She had been vague, saying it was something last minute, something she couldn't avoid. But I didn't believe her. Not anymore. After weeks of trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, after weeks of brushing off every late-night excuse, I was done. I couldn't pretend any longer. If she wasn't going to tell me the truth, then I was going to find it myself. I sat in the living room with my laptop, the rain pattering against the windows, the sound of it only adding to the tension building in my chest. My stomach churned as I opened my browser. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, anything that would confirm what I already knew deep down. I started with social media. Chloe was careful, but not that careful. Her posts were generic, her public profile spotless, but I knew Alex's name now. I typed it into the search bar, my fingers trembling. There he was, his profile open for anyone to see. His photos were all work-related, mostly shots of the gallery and his artwork. But one picture caught my eye. It was a group photo from a recent gallery event, and there she was, standing right next to him, her hand lightly resting on his arm. They weren't touching in an obvious way, but the look on her face, the way she tilted her head slightly toward him, it was enough to make my blood boil. I stared at that picture for what felt like forever. The anger I had tried so hard to suppress came rushing to the surface, hot and suffocating. I slammed the laptop shut and stood up, pacing the room. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I couldn't just sit there anymore. I grabbed my jacket, my car keys, and headed out the door. The rain was coming down hard now, the wind whipping through the trees. I didn't care. I drove through the city, my mind racing, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I knew where she was. She'd mentioned the gallery's name earlier, and I knew they were holding some kind of event tonight. I wasn't invited, of course. I hadn't been invited to any of her events in weeks. She always had an excuse: it's a small gathering, nothing formal, or you don't need to come, it's just work. But tonight, I wasn't going to stay home. Tonight, I was going to see for myself. I pulled up to the gallery, and parked a few blocks away. The rain was still coming down in sheets, and I was soaked by the time I reached the entrance. The place was buzzing with people, well-dressed guests holding glasses of wine, chatting and laughing under the warm glow of the gallery's lights. I walked in like I belonged there, my wet clothes sticking to my skin, my heart pounding in my chest. I scanned the room, looking for her, and then I saw them. Chloe and Alex were standing near a corner, away from the main crowd. They were talking, their heads close together, their expressions serious. I couldn't hear what they were saying over the hum of conversation around me, but I didn't need to. I could see it in their body language, in the way she looked at him, in the way he leaned in just slightly, like he was telling her something meant only for her. I felt my hands curl into fists at my sides, every muscle in my body tensing. I wanted to march over there, to pull her aside and demand an explanation. But I didn't, not yet. I wasn't ready to make a scene. I needed more. I needed her to tell me, in her own words, what we had become. I moved closer, keeping to the edges of the room, trying to stay out of sight. I watched as they laughed at something, her hand brushing his arm. It wasn't just friendly. It wasn't professional. It was personal, intimate in a way that I hadn't seen between us in a long time. I couldn't take it anymore. The anger, the betrayal, the frustration, it all boiled over. I turned and walked out of the gallery, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. I stood under the awning, rain pouring down around me, trying to catch my breath. I felt like I was going to explode. I leaned against the wall, running a hand through my wet hair, and closed my eyes. What was I doing? What was I even hoping to find? I already knew the truth. I didn't need her to say it. I didn't need to hear it from her lips. I had seen enough. But still, I couldn't walk away. Not yet. I had to confront her. I had to give her one last chance to come clean. I had to hear her say it, whatever it was, so I could finally move forward, one way or another. When she finally walked out of the gallery, it was late. I had been sitting in my car, waiting, watching the entrance. I saw her step out into the rain, her coat pulled tight around her, and I got out. She didn't see me until I was standing right in front of her. The look on her face when she realized I was there, shock, guilt, maybe even fear, was all the confirmation I needed. I didn't even have to ask her anything. I could see it in her eyes. She knew I knew. "Evan," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. I stared at her, my heart pounding, my emotions swirling so violently I didn't know what to say. I wanted to yell, to demand answers, to ask her why. But the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stand there, the rain soaking through my clothes, and wait for her to speak. I stood there in the rain, staring at her, waiting for her to say something, anything that could make sense of what I had just seen. Chloe looked at me, her face pale, her eyes wide. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something, but then she just shook her head and glanced away. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the sound of rain hitting the pavement. I was soaked to the bone, but I barely noticed. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. I couldn't stop thinking about the way she and Alex had been standing together in the gallery, the way they had looked at each other. I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't unfeel the sickening knot in my stomach. "Evan," she finally said, her voice low and hesitant. "What are you doing here?" Her question hit me harder than I expected. What was I doing here? I had driven across the city in a storm, stood outside the gallery for hours, all to confirm what I already knew in my gut. I had been desperate for answers, for proof. But now that I was face to face with her, I didn't know what to say. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Instead, I just stared at her, the hurt and anger bubbling up inside me like a volcano about to erupt. "What am I doing here?" I finally said, my voice shaking. "I think you know." I could see the panic in her eyes as the weight of my words sank in. She opened her mouth, then closed it, as if trying to figure out how to respond. "Chloe," I said, taking a step closer. "Don't lie to me. Not this time. I saw you. I saw the way you looked at him. I'm not an idiot." My voice broke on the last word, and I hated how vulnerable I sounded. I had come here to confront her, to demand the truth. But now that I was standing in front of her, I felt like I was falling apart. She hesitated, then took a step back. "Evan," she said, her voice trembling. "You're reading too much into this. Alex is just a friend, I've told you that." Hearing her say it again, so casually, made my blood boil. "A friend?" I shot back. "You don't look at your friends like that, Chloe. You don't spend all your time with them, cancel plans with your husband, and sneak around behind his back. Don't tell me it's nothing. I'm not blind." I could feel my hands curling into fists at my sides. Not out of anger, but out of frustration. I was trying so hard to keep my emotions in check, but every word she said felt like a slap in the face. Evan, she started, her voice soft, almost pleading. It's not what you think, I cut her off. Then tell me what it is, I said, my voice rising. Because from where I'm standing, it looks a hell of a lot like you've been lying to me. It looks like you've been spending all your time with him while I'm sitting at home, waiting for you to come back. It looks like you've replaced me, Chloe. I could feel my chest tightening as the words spilled out, as all the pain and doubt I'd been carrying came rushing to the surface. She stared at me, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. It's not that simple, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not. Evan, I'm not trying to hurt you. I laughed, but it came out bitter and hollow. Not trying to hurt me? I said. Chloe, you've been hurting me for months. You've been pulling away, shutting me out, making me feel like I'm losing my mind. And now I find out that you've been spending all this time with Alex. And you expect me to believe it's innocent? You expect me to just accept that nothing's going on? She shook her head, looking down at the ground. I never meant for it to get like this, she said. I didn't want to make you feel this way. I was just trying to keep things together. Her words felt like a punch to the gut. Keep things together? I said, my voice sharp. By lying to me? By sneaking around with another man? How is that supposed to keep things together? Chloe's shoulders slumped, and she looked so small, so defeated, that for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered everything I'd seen, everything I'd felt. And the anger came rushing back. I want the truth, Chloe, I said, my voice firm. I want you to tell me what's really going on. No more excuses. No more lies. Just tell me the truth. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. Evan, she said slowly, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I've been feeling so lost. So disconnected. And Alex, he was just there. He was someone I could talk to. Someone who understood. Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. So you're saying it's my fault? I said, my voice rising again. You're saying that because I wasn't enough, you turned to him? Is that it? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face now. No, she said, her voice breaking. That's not what I'm saying. I didn't know how to talk to you anymore. I didn't know how to fix us. And I thought. She stopped, taking a shaky breath. I thought if I could just find a little bit of clarity, a little bit of peace, then maybe I could figure out how to make things better. I stared at her, my mind reeling. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to tell her how much she'd hurt me, to make her understand the depth of the pain she'd caused. But another part of me felt like I couldn't breathe, like I couldn't take in everything she was saying. I turned away, running a hand through my hair, trying to collect my thoughts. The rain was still falling, cold and relentless, and I felt just as lost as she looked. After what felt like an eternity, I turned back to her. You should have come to me, I said quietly. You should have talked to me. Instead, you pushed me away. You shut me out, and now I don't even know who you are anymore. She took a step closer, reaching out like she wanted to touch me, but I stepped back. Don't, I said, my voice hard. I need time, Chloe. I need time to think. To figure out what this all means. Because right now, I don't know if I can do this anymore. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. She nodded slowly, tears still streaming down her face. I understand, she said. And as I turned and walked away, the rain still pouring down, I realized that no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. I drove home that night with the rain pounding against the windshield, the rhythmic thrum of the wipers doing little to soothe the storm raging in my chest. Every mile felt heavier than the last, each traffic light dragging out the trip just a little longer, as though the universe wasn't quite ready to let me go. My mind was a mess, cycling through everything Chloe had said, every tear that streaked down her face, every ounce of guilt that weighed on her voice. I wanted to scream at her, to demand why, to ask her what the hell she was thinking when she let things get this far. And yet, there was another part of me that didn't have the strength for anger anymore. I was tired of feeling like a stranger in my own life, tired of waiting for someone else's decisions to dictate my happiness. tired of pretending that if I held on long enough, she'd come back to me the way she used to be. The house felt emptier than it ever had when I finally walked through the door. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound as I stood in the dimly lit kitchen, staring at the place we used to share. I tried to imagine what it would be like to live here without her. The space seemed too big, too cold. I'd built a life with Chloe in this house, a life full of laughter, love, late-night conversations that stretched into the early hours. Those days felt so far away now, like another lifetime. What was I supposed to do with all those memories? Box them up and store them somewhere? Leave them on the shelf to gather dust? I didn't know. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here tonight. Not like this. I grabbed my keys again and headed back out into the storm. The rain hadn't let up, and the roads were slick, reflecting the blurred glow of headlights and street lamps. I didn't have a destination in mind, just a need to get away, to think, to breathe. My hands gripped the wheel tighter than they needed to, the tension in my arms spreading through my entire body. I kept hearing her words, over and over, "I never meant for it to get like this." As if that made it any better. As if her intentions erased the damage she'd done. I wasn't sure which hurt more, the betrayal itself, or the realization that she'd let it happen, even as she claimed to care about me. I wanted to believe her, to trust that she never meant to hurt me, but trust wasn't something you could just flip on like a light switch. It had to be earned, and she'd burned through all of it. I found myself at the waterfront, parked in a spot overlooking the bay. The rain streaked the car windows, blurring the view of the water and the distant lights of the city. It was a spot we used to come to together, back when things were simpler, when we didn't need an excuse to spend hours talking. I killed the engine and just sat there, listening to the rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. The memories were too vivid to ignore. I could still hear her laugh, still see the way she'd lean against me as we watched the waves crash against the shore. I could still feel the warmth of her hand in mine, the way she'd squeeze it just a little tighter when she wanted to let me know she was happy. It was unbearable. I closed my eyes and leaned back in the seat, trying to push those thoughts away. But they kept coming, relentless. I didn't know how long I sat there. Time seemed to stretch and blur, the minutes slipping away as the storm outside showed no signs of stopping. I thought about calling someone, a friend, maybe, or even Richard, but the idea of explaining everything felt exhausting. What would I say? That my marriage had fallen apart, that the woman I loved had chosen another man, and that now I was left sitting in the dark, wondering what the hell to do next. It felt pathetic. I was a grown man, a successful professional, someone who was supposed to have it all figured out. Yet here I was, drowning in a sea of my own doubts and insecurities, unable to find a way forward. Eventually, I forced myself to start the car again. I couldn't sit there forever. I drove aimlessly, the streets mostly deserted this late at night. The rain had finally started to let up, the downpour easing into a steady drizzle. My thoughts wandered to the future. What would it look like without her? Could I rebuild a life on my own? Or would I always be haunted by what I'd lost? I wanted to believe I was strong enough to move on, but the truth was, I felt like a part of me had been ripped away, leaving an open wound that refused to heal. I couldn't imagine dating again. Couldn't imagine letting someone else into my life after everything that had happened. The idea of starting over felt overwhelming, almost impossible. But what choice did I have? As I drove, I realized that the anger I'd felt earlier was fading, replaced by a deep sadness that I couldn't shake. I wasn't sure if it was for Chloe, for our marriage, or for myself. Maybe it was all of it. I hated that she had put me in this position, that she had forced me to question everything I thought I knew. I hated that I still cared about her, even after everything. But more than anything, I hated that I couldn't see a way out of this darkness. I wanted to move forward, to find some semblance of peace, but I didn't know where to start. By the time I made it back to the house, it was almost dawn. The sky was starting to lighten, the rain now just a gentle mist. I parked the car in the driveway and sat there for a moment, staring at the front door. It was strange to think that I might be walking into a house that no longer felt like home. I'd always thought of it as a safe haven, a place where I could be myself, where I could share my life with the person I loved. But now, it felt like just another empty shell, filled with memories that I didn't know how to handle. I finally got out of the car and went inside. The silence was deafening. I stood in the entryway, looking around at the familiar furniture, the photos on the walls, the little touches that Chloe had added over the years. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, stuck in the past, holding on to something that was no longer there. I needed to let go. I needed to find a way to move on, to rebuild. But I also knew it wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't something I could fix overnight. It would take time, patience, and a strength I wasn't sure I had. But I had to try. I owed it to myself to try. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, I took a deep breath and sat down on the couch. I didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a small flicker of hope. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew that I couldn't keep looking back. It was time to start finding my way forward, one step at a time. I never imagined my life could take such a drastic turn. But in the end, I didn't just learn the truth, I made sure everyone knew it. What would you do in my place? Could you find the strength to move on, or would you seek justice no matter the cost? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to share this story with someone who needs to hear it. The hardest lesson I've learned is that trust, once broken, can't be easily repaired. It's not just about second chances, it's about taking responsibility for our actions and the pain we cause. As a society, we need to hold ourselves accountable and prioritize honesty in our relationships, whether personal or professional. Only then can we rebuild trust and strengthen our communities. The path forward isn't simple, but it starts with each of us making the choice to live with integrity every day.